You're driving through the dead of night. Nothing but endless asphalt stretching ahead and darkness pressing in from all sides. Your only companions are the hum of your engine and the occasional crackle of your CB radio. But what happens when that darkness starts moving? When your radio picks up voices that shouldn't exist? When every mile marker becomes a countdown to something terrifying? Tonight, we're climbing into the cab with 11 long-haul truckers who encountered horrors that defy explanation on America's loneliest highways. These are the stories that truckers whisper about at rest stops. The encounters that make even the most experienced drivers question what's really out there in the void between cities. From phantom convoys that appear in your mirrors to cargo that whispers your name, from stalkers who can keep pace with an 18-wheeler to radio transmissions from drivers who died decades ago. These nightmares will make you think twice about every shadow dancing in your headlights. So buckle up, because once we hit the road with these drivers, there's no turning back from the terror that awaits in the endless night. The desert highway stretched endlessly ahead of me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Nevada wasteland like a scar across the earth's face. At 2:30 in the morning, with nothing but my headlights piercing the thick winter fog, I should have been alone out there. But I wasn't. My name is Lettie, and I've been hauling freight across this country for 15 years. I've seen sunrise over the Rockies, weathered ice storms in Montana, and navigated through hurricanes along the Gulf Coast. In all that time, I thought I'd encountered every kind of road condition, every type of driver, and every possible hazard the highway could throw at me. I was wrong. Dead wrong. That night in January, I was running a load of electronics from Los Angeles to Denver, taking the northern route through Nevada to avoid construction delays on I-40. The weather had turned nasty around Reno, with fog rolling in so thick I could barely see my own hood ornament. I'd considered pulling over at the next truck stop, but my delivery schedule was tight, and I knew these roads like the back of my hand. Besides, my Peterbilt had been my home for over a decade. She'd never let me down before. The CB radio had been quiet for hours, which wasn't unusual for this stretch. Most drivers avoided Highway 50 through central Nevada, calling it the loneliest road in America, for good reason. Mile after mile of nothing but sagebrush, abandoned mining towns, and the occasional coyote brave enough to venture near the asphalt. It was exactly the kind of desolate run I preferred. No traffic, no hassles, just me and the road. That's when I first saw them in my mirrors. At first, it was just a faint glow behind me, barely visible through the fog. I figured another trucker had decided to brave the weather, probably running the same route I was. But as the minutes passed, something felt off. The headlights never got closer, never fell back. They just maintained the exact same distance behind me, like they were tethered to my trailer. I tried raising them on the CB. "Hey there, driver behind me on the 50. You got your ears on?" Nothing but static. I tried again, switching to different channels. Still nothing. The fog was thick, but not thick enough to completely block radio signals. Any professional driver would have responded, if only to coordinate our speeds and maintain safe following distance. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In my passenger side mirror, I caught a glimpse of the truck behind me during a brief clearing in the fog. It looked old. Really old. The headlights were the old sealed beam style from the 60s or 70s, and the cab had the high, square profile of vintage Kenworths and Peterbilts. But that wasn't what scared me. What scared me was that I could see two more sets of headlights behind it, maintaining that same perfect formation. I was being followed by a convoy of antique trucks in the middle of nowhere, and they weren't talking on the radio. My foot unconsciously pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed from 65 to 70, then to 75. The headlights behind me kept perfect pace. I slowed down to 60. They slowed down too. No matter what speed I chose, that ghostly convoy maintained its position exactly 1/4 mile behind me. The fog began to shift and swirl in ways that didn't match the wind patterns I was used to. Instead of the natural rolling movements you'd expect, it seemed to part deliberately, creating corridors that led off the main highway. And each time one of these fog corridors opened up, revealing side roads that shouldn't exist on this barren stretch, the convoy behind me would flash their lights 3 times. After the 4th time this happened, I realized they weren't just following me. They were trying to guide me somewhere. My GPS started acting strange around mile marker 127. The screen flickered, and for a moment, it showed roads that weren't on my maps. Dirt tracks and unmarked paths branching off into the desert, leading to destinations with names I'd never heard of. Broken Wheel Station, Devil's Rest Stop, Last Call Junction. When the screen stabilized, these phantom routes disappeared, but the feeling that I was being led somewhere remained. The convoy's behavior became more insistent. The lead truck, I could now make out its distinctive chrome bumper and the silhouette of its tall exhaust stacks, began pulling closer during the fog breaks. Close enough that I could see into the cab during the brief moments when visibility improved. What I saw there will haunt me until my dying day. The driver's seat wasn't empty, but it wasn't occupied by anything human either. Where a face should have been, there was just shadow, a perfect void in the shape of a head and shoulders. The truck was driving itself, or being driven by something that had no business being behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler. I grabbed my CB radio and started transmitting on every emergency channel I knew. Mayday, Mayday, this is Lettie in a blue Peterbilt on Highway 50, mile marker 132. I've got multiple vehicles following me, possibly hijackers or worse. Any law enforcement in the area, please respond. The radio crackled with interference, but no human voices came through. What came through instead was something that made me question my sanity. Static filled the speaker, then slowly cleared to reveal the sound of diesel engines idling. Not just any engines, the deep, throaty rumble of old trucks, the kind that used mechanical fuel injection instead of modern computer controls. Under that mechanical symphony, I could hear voices talking in low, urgent tones. But when I tried to focus on what they were saying, the words seemed to slip away like smoke. Then, clear as day, I heard my own voice coming through the radio. "Take the next right, Lettie. We've been waiting for you." My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio's power switch. But before I could turn it off, the voice continued. "You can't outrun us forever, honey. This route belongs to us now. Has for decades." The next right was a dirt road I'd never noticed before, barely visible through the fog. As my headlights swept across it, I could see tire tracks, big rig tracks, leading into the darkness. Fresh tracks, but also others that looked old, weathered by years of desert wind and rain. I kept driving straight, but the convoy behind me had other plans. The lead truck pulled into the left lane and began pacing me, its faceless driver turning that void where a head should be in my direction. The second truck moved to the right shoulder, boxing me in. The third stayed behind, completing the trap. My speedometer read 80 mep, then 85, then 90. The old trucks matched my speed effortlessly, their engines never straining, never falling back. It was impossible. Trucks from the 60s and 70s simply couldn't maintain those speeds, especially not uphill through mountain passes. That's when I realized we were no longer on Highway 50. The road beneath my wheels was different. Rougher, narrower, with the kind of worn asphalt you'd find on abandoned rural routes. The mile markers were wrong too. Instead of the familiar Nevada highway markers, these were old wooden posts with hand-painted numbers that made no sense. 666, 13, 0, and 7. The fog began to lift, and what I saw ahead made my heart stop completely. There, maybe half a mile down this impossible road, sat a truck stop that belonged in a museum. The old-style pumps, the vintage neon sign, the classic diner architecture, everything about it screamed 1960s America. But the buildings were dark, abandoned, with weeds growing through cracks in the parking lot. The convoy was herding me toward this ghost truck stop, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. As we got closer, I could see more trucks in the parking lot. Dozens of them, all vintage models, all perfectly preserved, but obviously abandoned. Some had their doors hanging open. Others had spider webs covering their windshields. A few had skeletons still sitting in the driver's seats, their bony hands resting on steering wheels they'd never release. My CB radio crackled back to life, filled with voices now, dozens of them, all talking at once. "Welcome to the last stop, Lettie. You'll like it here. The coffee's always hot. Don't worry about your delivery schedule anymore. Time works differently here. We've all been waiting so long for new company." I slammed on my brakes, but my truck kept moving forward as if the laws of physics had stopped applying to me. The speedometer showed 0, but the ghost truck stop kept getting bigger in my windshield. The convoy behind me had disappeared, but I could see their drivers now. Dozens of faceless figures standing among the abandoned rigs, waiting to welcome me to whatever hell this place really was. Then, just as my truck was about to enter the parking lot of the damned, my GPS screen blazed with white light and displayed a single message. Recalculating route. I found myself back on Highway 50. The familiar mile markers restored, the fog natural once again. My CB radio was silent. My mirrors showed nothing but empty road stretching behind me. But when I checked my logbook later, I discovered something that still gives me chills. According to every official record, the stretch of Highway 50, where I encountered that phantom convoy, was flooded in 1962 when the Washoe Dam failed. 17 truckers died in that disaster. Their rigs swept away and never recovered. The old truck stop I saw? It was destroyed in the same flood, along with everyone who was inside it that night. I still drive the long-haul routes, but I avoid Highway 50 through Nevada. Some roads are meant for the living, and others, well, others belong to drivers who never reach their final destination. If you're ever out there on the loneliest road in America and you see vintage headlights in your mirrors, don't follow where they want to lead you. Some deliveries are never meant to be completed. They say you should never open a sealed trailer. But when the cargo starts whispering your name at 3 in the morning, every rule you've ever learned goes straight out the window. What I found inside that refrigerated unit changed everything I thought I knew about the freight I'd been hauling for the past 6 months. My name is Krue, and I'd only been driving solo for about 3 months when I picked up what should have been a routine reefer load out of Billings, Montana. I was still green enough to be excited about every run, still proving myself to the company and trying to build up my reputation as a reliable driver. The load was bound for Portland, Oregon. Frozen foods, according to the manifest. Nothing unusual about it, except for the specific instructions printed in red ink across the top of my paperwork. Do not open trailer Under any circumstances, temperature must remain at 10 deg. Direct delivery only. The pickup went smooth enough. The shipper's warehouse was one of those industrial facilities on the outskirts of town, all concrete and steel with no windows. The guys loading my trailer worked fast and didn't say much, which wasn't uncommon in this business. They sealed the doors with heavy-duty locks and tamper-evident tape, handed me the paperwork, and I was rolling west on I-90 within an hour. The first day passed without incident. Montana countryside rolled by outside my windows, endless prairie punctuated by distant mountain ranges, the kind of scenery that makes you understand why people fall in love with the road. My reefer unit hummed along steadily, maintaining the required temperature. Everything was running exactly as it should. It was on the second night, somewhere between Missoula and Coeur d'Alene, when I first heard the sounds. I was pulling through a construction zone, down to one lane with concrete barriers on both sides. Traffic was light, just me and maybe 2 other trucks spread out over a 5-mile stretch. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from behind me. At first, I figured it was just the trailer settling, maybe some of the cargo shifting as I navigated the uneven pavement. But the tapping came in patterns, 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS in Morse code. I tried to dismiss it. Frozen food doesn't tap out distress signals. My imagination was running wild because of the isolation and the late hour. But as I continued down that empty highway, the tapping became more insistent, more desperate. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. Muffled voices coming from inside the trailer. They were faint at first, barely audible over the road noise and the hum of the refrigeration unit. But during the quiet moments when I was coasting downhill, I could make them out clearly. Multiple voices, both men and women, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were afraid. I pulled over at the next rest area and walked around to the back of my trailer. The voices stopped immediately, as if whatever was inside knew I was listening. I pressed my ear against the cold metal doors and waited. Nothing. But when I started walking back to my cab, the tapping resumed, more frantic than before. My CB radio had been quiet all night, which was unusual for this stretch of highway. I tried raising other drivers, hoping to find someone who could talk me through what I was experiencing. Breaker 19. This is eastbound Krue looking for a radio check on I-90. Static. I tried again on different channels. More static, it was like I was the only driver left in the world. That's when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed my own number. I stared at the screen, thinking it had to be some kind of glitch. But the phone kept ringing. Against my better judgment, I answered. Hello? My own voice came through the speaker, distorted and hollow. Don't trust what they told you about the cargo crew. Check the manifest again. Really check it. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the shipping paperwork and examined it under the dome light. At first glance, it looked the same as before. Frozen foods, Portland delivery, standard reefer load. But as I looked closer, I noticed something I'd missed during the initial pickup. The product codes were wrong. Instead of the standard food industry classifications, these codes corresponded to something else entirely. Medical specimens, biological samples. And according to the fine print I'd glossed over, they weren't frozen. They were being kept in a state of suspended animation. The voices from the trailer started up again, louder now, more distinct. I could make out individual words. Help us. So cold. Can't move. Please. They weren't coming from speakers or some kind of recording. These were real human voices, coming from inside a sealed refrigerated trailer that was supposed to contain nothing but frozen vegetables. I had to know what I was carrying. The locks on the trailer doors were industrial grade, but I'd learned a few things during my brief career that weren't covered in driving school. It took me 20 minutes with a crowbar from my toolkit, but I finally got the doors open. The blast of frigid air that hit me carried a smell I'll never forget. Not the clean, metallic scent of a normal freezer, but something organic and wrong. Inside the trailer, instead of pallets of frozen food, I found row upon row of clear cylindrical containers, each about the size of a phone booth. And inside each container, suspended in some kind of preservative fluid, was a human being. They were all alive. Their eyes tracked my movement as I stumbled deeper into the trailer, their mouths moving behind the glass, trying to speak through whatever apparatus was keeping them breathing. Men, women, different ages and ethnicities, dozens of them, all trapped in this mobile prison that I'd been unknowingly transporting across state lines. A clipboard hanging near the door contained detailed information about each specimen. Names, ages, dates of acquisition, and notes about their suitability for long-term preservation studies. At the bottom of each sheet was a destination, not Portland, Oregon, but a private research facility in the Cascade Mountains that didn't appear on any maps. One of the containers was labeled Krue Morrison, age 24, acquired 3/15/2024. My own photo was attached to the paperwork, along with detailed personal information that no legitimate shipping company should have possessed. According to the notes, I was scheduled to join the collection upon delivery completion. The voices I'd been hearing weren't coming from the people in the containers. They were coming from my CB radio, which had been modified with equipment I'd never seen before. The entire truck had been rigged to monitor and record everything I said and did. My cell phone, my GPS, even my engine diagnostics were being transmitted to someone who had been tracking my every move since I'd picked up this nightmare cargo. As I stood there in that frozen hell, trying to process what I'd discovered, my radio crackled to life with a familiar voice, the dispatcher who had given me this load. "Hello, Krue. I see you've decided to take a peek at your cargo. That's unfortunate. We really hoped you'd be more compliant." I ran for the cab, but my truck wouldn't start. The engine turned over but wouldn't catch, as if someone had remotely disabled the ignition system. The radio continued. "Don't worry, Krue. The collection team is already en route to your location. You'll be much more comfortable once you're properly preserved. The cold slows down all biological processes, including fear and pain. Our subjects find it quite peaceful after the initial adjustment period." Through my windshield, I could see headlights approaching from both directions. Large vehicles, moving fast, closing in on my position. But I remembered something my trainer had taught me during my first week on the road. Every truck has an emergency fuel cutoff that bypasses the electronic systems. It's a manual override that truckers pray they'll never need to use. I found the switch behind the driver's seat and flipped it. The engine roared to life immediately. I threw the transmission into gear and floored the accelerator, leaving the trailer and its horrific cargo behind. In my mirrors, I watched as the approaching vehicle stopped at the abandoned trailer, figures in hazmat suits swarming around it like ants. I drove straight to the nearest police station and told them everything. The investigation that followed uncovered a network of illegal human experimentation that had been operating for years, using long-haul truckers as unwitting accomplices. The research facility in the Cascades was raided, and hundreds of victims were recovered alive. But here's what still keeps me awake at night. According to the police report, there was no driver named Krue Morrison in the company's employment records. No paperwork for the load I'd picked up. No record of the truck I'd been driving. As far as anyone could prove, I'd never existed as a driver for that company. The only evidence that any of it had happened was the trailer full of victims and the modified CB radio they found in a truck registered to a man who had died 3 months earlier. A man whose body was discovered in one of those preservation containers with a note attached. Replacement driver acquired and conditioned, ready for Phase 2 implementation. I still don't know who I really am or how long I was driving for that company before I became aware of what I was carrying. Sometimes I catch myself in mirrors and wonder if the face looking back is really mine, or if it belongs to someone else who made the mistake of opening a trailer that should have stayed sealed. The road holds secrets that go deeper than any of us realize, and some cargo is better left uninspected. Trust me on that. When you're driving 70 miles per hour down a dark interstate and the same person keeps appearing at every mile marker you pass, you start to question everything you know about physics and reality. What scared me most wasn't that he was there. It was that he seemed to know exactly where I was going before I did. My name is Shimon, and I've been running freight with my family's trucking company for 20 years. 3 generations of us have worked these highways, hauling everything from livestock to heavy machinery across the continental United States. My grandfather started the business in 1967 with a single Kenworth and a dream, and my father expanded it into a small fleet of 12 trucks. Now it was my turn to carry on the legacy, and I took that responsibility seriously. We had a reputation for reliability and safety that I wasn't about to compromise. The night everything changed, I was hauling a load of agricultural equipment from Des Moines to Denver, running I-80 through Nebraska. It was a route I'd driven hundreds of times, one of those runs where you could practically drive it in your sleep. The weather was perfect for November. Clear skies, no wind, temperature hovering around 40 degrees. Ideal conditions for making good time and staying on schedule. I'd left Iowa around sunset, planning to drive straight through to Colorado with just the mandatory rest breaks. The first few hours were routine. Steady traffic, good CB chatter, everything running smoothly. It wasn't until I hit the Nebraska state line around 11 p.m. that things started to get strange. The traffic had thinned out considerably by then, which was normal for that time of night on a weekday. What wasn't normal was the figure I saw standing beside mile marker 126. At first glance, he looked like any other person you might encounter on the roadside. Average height, dark clothing, standing motionless about 10 feet from the guardrail. Nothing particularly noteworthy about him, except for the fact that he was standing perfectly still in the middle of nowhere at midnight. I thought maybe his car had broken down and he was waiting for help, so I grabbed my CB to see if anyone had reported a stranded motorist. But before I could key the mic, I passed mile marker 127, and there he was again. Same person, same posture, same dark clothing, standing in exactly the same position relative to the mile marker. That's when I knew something was wrong. There's no way someone could cover a mile on foot in the time it took me to drive it at highway speed, especially not while maintaining the exact same pose and positioning. But there he was, as clear as day in my headlights as I passed. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was 2 different people who happened to be dressed similarly. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by fatigue or the way my headlights were hitting roadside debris. But when I passed mile marker 128 and saw him a 3rd time, I had to face the fact that something impossible was happening. This time, I slowed down and really looked at him as I approached. The figure never moved, never acknowledged my truck, never turned his head. He simply stood there like a statue. facing the oncoming traffic with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. As my headlights swept over him, I could see that he wasn't breathing. His chest never rose or fell, and in the crisp November air, there was no visible exhale vapor. But the most disturbing thing was his face. Even from the cab of my truck, passing at 50 miles per hour, I could see that his expression was completely neutral. No emotion, no recognition, no sign of life beyond the mere fact that he was standing upright. His eyes seemed to track my movement as I passed, but there was nothing behind them, like looking into the eyes of a mannequin. I grabbed my CB and started transmitting. Breaker 19, this is Big Rig Shimon eastbound on I-80 at mile marker 128. Anyone else seeing anything unusual out here tonight? The response came back immediately, but it wasn't from another trucker. It was my own voice, clear as day, coming through the speaker. Mile marker 129 coming up, Shimon. I'll be waiting. My hands were shaking as I reached for the radio's volume control. But before I could turn it down, the voice continued. You can't outrun what's already inside your head, brother. Might as well accept it and enjoy the ride. Mile marker 129 appeared in my headlights, and sure enough, there he was. But this time, something had changed. The figure was holding something. A CB radio identical to mine. As I passed, I could see his lips moving, speaking into the handset with perfect synchronization to the words coming through my speaker. Mile marker 130, Shimon, getting closer to where you need to be. I floored the accelerator, pushing my rig up to 85 miles per hour. The figure at mile marker 130 was waiting, radio in hand, mouth moving in perfect time with the transmission. Speed won't help you, brother. I've been keeping pace with you for the last 100 miles. Didn't you notice? That's when I realized the horrible truth. I'd been seeing this figure for much longer than I'd consciously recognized. My brain had been filtering out the earlier sightings, dismissing them as roadside debris or tricks of light. But now that I was paying attention, I could remember glimpses of him stretching back hours, always there, always in the same position relative to each mile marker, always tracking my progress with those dead, lifeless eyes. My GPS started acting erratically around mile marker 135. The screen flickered between my actual location and routes that didn't exist, showing me taking exits that weren't there and following roads that led to destinations with names like Final Rest, End Point, and Last Mile Trucking. Each time the screen glitched, my radio would crackle with that familiar voice, my voice, providing commentary on my location and mental state. Getting nervous, Shimon? That's normal. Most drivers start to panic around mile marker 140. That's when they realize they're not really in control of where they're going anymore. I tried changing lanes, thinking maybe I could break whatever pattern was controlling this nightmare. But no matter which lane I chose, the figure was always positioned perfectly to be visible as I passed each mile marker. Left lane, right lane, shoulder, it didn't matter. He was always there, always in the optimal position to make eye contact with me as I drove by. The worst part was that other trucks were passing me regularly, and their drivers seemed completely oblivious to what was happening. I could see them in my mirrors, maintaining normal speeds, their CB radios chattering with typical road conversation about weather and traffic conditions. But every time I tried to join their conversations, my transmissions came back to me in my own voice, providing updates on my psychological deterioration. Mile marker 145, Shimon. You're starting to hyperventilate. That's not good for your driving performance. Maybe you should pull over and rest. But I knew that stopping would be the worst thing I could do. Whatever was happening to me, whatever this figure represented, it wanted me to stop. It wanted me to get out of my truck and join it by the side of the road, standing motionless at the next mile marker, waiting for the next victim to drive by. The figure's behavior started escalating around mile marker 150. Instead of just standing still, it began waving at me as I passed. Not a friendly wave, but a slow, mechanical gesture that looked like it was being operated by remote control. The CB transmissions became more frequent and more personal. Your grandfather would be disappointed in you, Shimon. He never lost control of a load like this. He knew how to handle the road and everything on it. Your father's watching from the office right now, wondering why your GPS signal keeps jumping around. He's worried about you, brother. Maybe you should call him and explain what's happening. Tell him about your new traveling companion. By mile marker 155, the figure was no longer alone. 2 more identical figures had joined him, all standing in the same pose, all holding CB radios, all speaking in unison through my speaker. Their synchronized voices created an echo effect that made my cab feel like it was surrounded by invisible speakers. Mile marker 160, Shimon. Time to make a choice. Keep driving and join our roadside vigil permanently. Or take the next exit and pretend this never happened. But you know you can't pretend forever. The next exit was number 161, leading to a small Nebraska town called Elm Creek. It wasn't on my route, but something about the name felt familiar. Like I'd been there before, even though I knew I hadn't. As I approached the decision point, the figures at mile marker 160 were doing something new. They were pointing toward the exit ramp, all 3 of them moving in perfect synchronization. My radio crackled one final time with my own voice, but now it sounded different. Older, more tired, resigned. Exit 161, Shimon. That's where this route really ends. That's where drivers like us go when we can't handle the road anymore. Your truck will be found abandoned at mile marker 165, but you'll be standing beside mile marker 161 for the next 20 years, waiting for someone else who needs to learn what you've learned tonight. I took the exit. The town of Elm Creek was smaller than I'd expected. Just a few buildings clustered around a main street, most of them dark at this hour. But there was a truck stop on the far side of town, and as I pulled into the parking lot, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were dozens of trucks parked there, all of them covered in dust and showing signs of long abandonment. And standing beside each truck, perfectly still in the fluorescent light, were their former drivers. Men and women of all ages, all holding CB radios, all staring at the highway with those same lifeless eyes I'd been seeing for the past 100 miles. I never made it to Denver with that load. According to the company records, my truck was found abandoned at mile marker 165 on I-80, engine still running, logbook open to the previous day's entries. But I know better. I'm still here in Elm Creek, standing beside mile marker 161, waiting for the next driver who thinks they can outrun what's chasing them down the highway. The road never really ends. It just changes drivers. The worst part about being a single mother on the road isn't the loneliness or the exhaustion. It's waking up in your sleeper berth, knowing that someone has been inside your truck while you slept. When you find evidence that a stranger has been watching you dream, touching your personal belongings, and learning everything about your children back home. Every shadow becomes a threat. My name is Sarahi, and I've been driving long haul for 3 years to support my 2 kids back in Phoenix. It's not the life I planned, but after my divorce, trucking offered the best pay I could find with just a high school education. The sacrifice is enormous. Weeks away from home, missing school plays and soccer games, trying to parent through video calls and text messages. But my children needed stability, and this job provided that even if it meant I had to become a ghost in their daily lives. I'd always been careful about security. You have to be as a woman in this industry. I kept my sleeper curtains drawn tight, always locked my doors, parked only in well-lit areas with good visibility, and never shared personal information with strangers. My truck was my mobile fortress, equipped with extra locks, a security camera system, and even a small safe bolted to the floor where I kept important documents and emergency cash. The first incident happened at a truck stop outside Amarillo, Texas. I'd been driving for 14 hours and needed my mandatory 10-hour break before continuing to my delivery in Houston. It was a familiar stop. Clean facilities, good security lighting, and plenty of other drivers around. I'd parked there dozens of times without incident. I always followed the same routine: quick shower in the facility, grab some food, then settle into my sleeper for the night. My truck was a newer Freightliner with a spacious sleeper berth that I'd turned into a cozy living space. Pictures of my kids, Isabella, 8, and Marcus, 6, covered one wall. I had a small TV, a mini fridge, and enough personal touches to make it feel like home. That night, I woke up around 3 a.m. feeling like something was wrong. The air in the sleeper felt different, like someone had disturbed it recently. I reached for the light switch, and that's when I noticed it. My photographs of the children had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just slightly repositioned so that they were more visible from the entry to the sleeper berth. Someone with knowledge of the truck's layout had deliberately displayed them for easier viewing. I checked my locks immediately. Everything was still secure with no signs of forced entry. The security cameras I'd installed showed nothing unusual, just the normal traffic of a busy truck stop. But I knew someone had been inside my truck. A mother's intuition about her personal space is never wrong, and every instinct I had was screaming that my sanctuary had been violated. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the driver's seat with a tire iron across my lap, watching every shadow that moved past my windows. Nothing happened, and by morning, I'd almost convinced myself it was just paranoia and exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. Almost. The second incident occurred a week later at a rest area in New Mexico. This time, I woke up to find that someone had been through my personal belongings with surgical precision. My clothes had been refolded differently. My toiletries were arranged in a new pattern. Most disturbing of all, my phone had been moved from the charging cable beside my bed to the small table near the entry, and it showed signs of being accessed. When I checked my recent calls and messages, everything appeared normal. But buried in my phone's photo gallery, I found pictures I hadn't taken. Images of me sleeping, photographed from inside my own truck. Someone had been documenting my most vulnerable moments, creating a record of when and how I slept, what I wore to bed, how I positioned myself in the narrow berth. The photos were taken from different angles, suggesting the intruder had spent considerable time inside my sleeper, moving around quietly enough not to wake me. Some showed close-ups of my face while sleeping. Others captured the family photos on my wall. A few focused on personal items like my driver's license and the letters my children had written me. I immediately called the police, but there was little they could do. No signs of forced entry, no witnesses, no clear evidence of criminal activity beyond trespassing. The officer who took my report suggested I was probably dealing with someone who had master keys for that particular truck model, possibly a mechanic or someone else in the trucking industry with access to manufacturer equipment. That possibility terrified me more than a random predator. It suggested someone with professional knowledge and resources, someone who could access my truck anywhere, anytime, regardless of the security measures I took. I started varying my routes and stopping patterns, avoiding places where I'd parked before. But the intrusions continued, always following the same pattern. No forced entry, subtle rearrangement of personal items, and new photos added to my phone. Each incident escalated slightly. The intruder became bolder, leaving more obvious signs of their presence. At a truck stop in Oklahoma, I found a note tucked inside one of my children's letters. Written in careful block letters, it read, "Isabella's school play is next Thursday. Marcus has a dentist appointment on Friday. You should be there for these important moments." Information that could only have come from reading my personal correspondence and accessing my phone's calendar. The psychological warfare was calculated and devastating. This person wasn't just invading my physical space. They were demonstrating complete knowledge of my life, my schedule, my children's activities. They were showing me how vulnerable my family was, how easily they could extend their reach beyond my truck to the people I was working so hard to protect. I hired a private investigator who specialized in stalking cases. She installed more sophisticated security equipment in my truck. Hidden cameras with motion activation, GPS tracking that would alert her if my truck was accessed while parked, and a silent alarm system connected directly to her monitoring service. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later at a truck stop in Arkansas. The hidden cameras finally captured him, a man in his 40s wearing a maintenance uniform, using what appeared to be a universal truck key to enter my sleeper. He moved through my space with practiced efficiency, photographing documents, rearranging items, and adding new pictures to my phone. But the most chilling part of the footage showed him sitting on my bed for nearly an hour, going through my children's letters one by one, reading them carefully while making notes in a small journal. He wasn't just stalking me. He was studying my family, learning their routines and vulnerabilities through my correspondence. The private investigator identified him as Dennis Crawford, a former truck mechanic who'd been fired from several companies for inappropriate behavior around female drivers. He'd been using his knowledge of truck security systems and collection of master keys to target women drivers across multiple states. When the police arrested him, they found a storage unit filled with hundreds of photographs, personal items stolen from trucks, and detailed files on at least 30 different female drivers. My file was the thickest, containing copies of every letter my children had written me, printouts of my delivery schedules, and even surveillance photos of my apartment complex in Phoenix. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed plan Crawford had developed for approaching my children. He'd mapped their school routes, identified their friends, and even applied for a job at Marcus's elementary school. The stalking of me was just the beginning. His ultimate goal was gaining access to my family. During the investigation, other drivers came forward with similar experiences. Women who'd attributed missing items and disturbed personal belongings to their own carelessness or fatigue. The pattern had been going on for years, with Crawford selecting targets based on their vulnerabilities. Single mothers, women driving alone, drivers who'd shared personal information on CB radio or at truck stops. Crawford received a 15-year sentence for stalking, breaking, and entering, and attempted child endangerment. But the damage to my sense of security was permanent. I couldn't continue driving long haul knowing how easily someone had turned my mobile home into a hunting ground. I found work with a local delivery company that gets me home every night. The pay is less and money is tighter, but I can tuck my children into their own beds and know that no stranger is watching them sleep. My truck now sits in my own driveway, where the only person with keys is me. The experience taught me that the road holds dangers beyond weather and traffic. Some of the most frightening predators are the ones who understand your world well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. They know that truck drivers are isolated, that we depend on the kindness of strangers, and that we often have no choice but to sleep in unsecured locations. For female drivers still out there, trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Invest in good security equipment, vary your routines, and never assume that locked doors are enough protection. The highway community likes to think of itself as a family. But like any family, it has members who can't be trusted. Some violations of safety go deeper than mechanical failures or road hazards. Sometimes the most dangerous breakdown is the collapse of trust itself, and that's a repair no mechanic can make. The road taught me to be strong and independent, but it also taught me that some prices are too high to pay for any amount of financial security. Home isn't just where your family lives. It's where you can sleep peacefully, knowing that no uninvited guests are watching your dreams. The mountains of West Virginia have always been known for bad radio reception. But when your CB starts broadcasting the final moments of a driver who died 37 years ago, you realize some signals never fade. What terrified me most wasn't hearing a dead man's voice. It was when he started responding to mine in real time. My name is Zyon, and I'm a second-generation trucker following routes my father carved out in the 1980s. He'd built a solid reputation running freight through the Appalachian corridors, establishing relationships with shippers and receivers that kept our small family operation profitable for decades. When he passed away last year, I inherited not just his business contacts, but his favorite routes, winding mountain highways that most drivers avoided, but that he navigated like they were his own backyard. The run from Charleston to Roanoke was one of his regulars, a challenging route through some of the most remote stretches of West Virginia and Virginia mountains. The roads were narrow, the grades steep, and cell phone coverage practically non-existent for long stretches. But the pay was good, and the shippers were loyal to our family name. It was exactly the kind of specialized run that kept small trucking companies competitive against the big corporate fleets. I'd driven this route maybe a dozen times since taking over the business, always during daylight hours when the mountain roads were safer and more manageable. But this particular load, industrial machinery bound for a manufacturing plant in Virginia, was running behind schedule due to loading delays. By the time I left Charleston, it was already past sunset, and I was facing a night drive through terrain that looked ominous even in broad daylight. The fog rolled in heavy around Beckley, that thick mountain mist that seems to rise from the valleys like something alive. Visibility dropped to maybe 50 feet in some sections, forcing me to crawl along at 35 miles per hour with my hazard lights flashing. The CB radio was mostly static at that altitude, with only occasional bursts of conversation from drivers on distant highways bleeding through the atmospheric interference. It was about 2 hours into the mountain section when I first heard the voice. The static cleared suddenly, replaced by crystal-clear audio of someone in obvious distress. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Big Joe running eastbound on Route 19. I've got brake failure coming down Gauley Mountain. Can't stop, can't stop." The voice was panicked but professional. A veteran driver dealing with every trucker's worst nightmare, a runaway truck on a mountain grade. I grabbed my mic immediately. "Driver on Route 19, this is Zyon. What's your 20? I can call for help or try to guide you to a runaway ramp." But there was no response. The transmission continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Jake, Sarah, if you can hear this, Daddy's in trouble. Tell Mama I love her. Tell her I tried to make it home." Something about the transmission felt wrong beyond just the obvious emergency. The audio quality was too clean for the mountain terrain, and the trucker's language sounded outdated. Terms and phrases that drivers had used decades ago, but that you rarely heard anymore. Modern CB protocol was different, and emergency procedures had evolved significantly since I'd started driving. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by the normal static and occasional distant chatter, I tried raising other drivers to see if anyone else had heard the distress call, but got no response. Mountain radio propagation was unpredictable. Sometimes you could talk to drivers hundreds of miles away, and sometimes you couldn't reach someone in the next valley. About 20 minutes later, the voice came back. "This is Big Joe, still eastbound on 19. Speeds up to about 70 now, past the Somersville exit. Brakes are completely gone." The same panic, the same professional composure despite facing certain death. But this time, something in the background caught my attention. The sound of his engine was wrong. It had the deep, mechanical roar of older trucks, the kind with mechanical fuel injection and straight pipes that hadn't been manufactured since the early 1980s. I keyed my mic again. "Big Joe, if you can hear me, there's a runaway truck ramp about 5 miles past Somersville. Look for the signs. You should be able to see reflectors even in this fog." This time, impossibly, he responded. "Who is this? Another driver? Thank God, I thought I was alone out here. Can you see my location?" The hair on my neck stood up. This was a real-time conversation with someone who was supposed to be broadcasting a recording or some kind of atmospheric echo. But the response was immediate and interactive, reacting to information I'd just provided. "This is Zyon. I'm about 10 miles behind you on the same route. What's your truck configuration?" "Blue Peterbilt 359, pulling a flatbed with steel beams. Been driving these mountains for 15 years, never had brake failure like this." The pedal went straight to the floor coming off the Somersville grade. The details were specific and immediate, but something still felt fundamentally wrong about the entire exchange. I asked the question that had been bothering me. "Big Joe, what year is it?" There was a long pause before he responded. "What kind of question is that? It's October 15th, 1987. Why are you asking me that?" My blood went cold. I was talking to someone who believed it was 1987, broadcasting on frequencies and using equipment that matched that era. But I was receiving him clearly in 2024, having a real-time conversation across a gap of 37 years. Either I was losing my mind, or the mountains were playing tricks with time itself. "Big Joe," I said carefully, "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Check your calendar. Check your logbook. What does it say?" Another pause, longer this time. "Says October 15th, 97, just like I told you. But that can't be right. My logbook looks wrong. Everything looks wrong. The roads look different than I remember." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Big Joe describing his location and situation in real time, while I tried to figure out what was happening. He was passing landmarks that I knew well, describing them accurately, but as they would have appeared decades ago. Construction projects that had been completed in the 1990s were described as new highway work. Businesses that had been closed for years were mentioned as active truck stops. Then he said something that made everything click into place. "I can see another truck up ahead. Looks like he might be in trouble too. Driver, are you running a blue Freightliner with Rodriguez Trucking on the doors?" Rodriguez Trucking was my father's company name. Painted on the truck he'd been driving the night he died in 1987. The night he'd suffered brake failure on Route 19 near Somersville and crashed into Gauley Mountain trying to avoid oncoming traffic. I was talking to my father. "Dad." The word came out before I could stop it. The radio went silent for what felt like an eternity. When the voice came back, it was different, confused, uncertain. "Who did you say this was?" "How do you know about Rodriguez Trucking?" That's my son's name. Zyon. But he's just a kid. He's back home with his mother." I tried to explain, but the transmission was breaking up. The atmospheric conditions that had allowed this impossible conversation were shifting, and the connection was fading. I could hear my father's voice growing more distant, more distorted. "I can see you now, son, in my mirror. You're all grown up. You're driving the route, keeping the business going. I'm proud of you, Zyon. Tell your mother I made it home after all." The last thing I heard clearly was the sound of brakes working, the hiss of air pressure that meant his system had somehow been restored. Then static and silence, and the normal background chatter of distant drivers on clear frequencies. I spent the rest of that night drive thinking about what I'd experienced. When I researched the accident later, I learned that my father's truck had indeed been found with brake failure, but witness reports suggested he'd somehow managed to slow the vehicle enough to minimize the impact. The crash investigators had been puzzled by evidence that his air brake system had functioned normally in the final moments, despite earlier signs of complete failure. I've driven that route many times since, always hoping to make contact again. But the frequency that carried my father's voice that night has remained silent. The mountains hold their secrets close, and some conversations are only meant to happen once. But I know now why he chose those difficult mountain routes, why he kept running them even when easier alternatives were available. He wasn't just building a business. He was creating a legacy that would outlast physical death, establishing connections that transcend the normal boundaries of time and space. The road doesn't just carry freight and cargo. Sometimes it carries voices that need to be heard, messages that need to be delivered, and love that refuses to be stopped by something as simple as dying. Some frequencies never really go silent. They just wait for the right atmospheric conditions to bridge the gap between where we've been and where we're going. Every time I key that CB mic in the West Virginia mountains, I'm hoping to hear my father's voice one more time. And maybe someday, when my own son takes over these routes, he'll pick up a transmission from a driver who sounds familiar, broadcasting from a time when the roads were different, but the love was exactly the same. There are places on the highway system where the normal rules don't apply, where way stations operate according to their own twisted logic, even when they've been abandoned for decades. When the scale starts displaying weights that defy physics, and the exit gate won't open until you've paid a price no legitimate government agency would ever demand. You realize some inspections measure more than just cargo tonnage. My name is Damari, and I've been an independent owner-operator for 8 years. Running my own rig means every decision affects my bottom line directly. Fuel efficiency, route planning, maintenance schedules, even which way stations to hit during mandatory inspections. I knew every scale house between Los Angeles and Miami. Which ones were notorious for lengthy delays, which inspectors were thorough but fair, and which facilities to avoid unless absolutely necessary. The Barstow Inspection Station on Highway 15 had been closed for renovation since early spring. I'd passed the shuttered facility dozens of times over the past few months, noting the construction barriers and closed to commercial traffic signs that diverted trucks to alternate inspection points 50 miles in either direction. It was an inconvenience that added time and fuel costs to every California run. But temporary closures were part of the business. That's why I was surprised when the electronic signs started directing me toward the Barstow station that scorching July afternoon. My load of industrial equipment was running heavy, right at the 80,000-pound federal limit, and I needed to verify my weight distribution before crossing into Nevada. The digital highway signs clearly indicated the facility was operational, with current wait times and lane assignments displayed just like any active way station. As I approached the entrance, nothing looked obviously wrong. The construction barriers had been removed, the approach lanes were freshly painted, and the electronic systems appeared to be functioning normally. The only unusual detail was the complete absence of other trucks. Typically, there would be at least a few rigs going through the scales, especially during peak afternoon hours on a major interstate corridor. I pulled onto the scale and waited for the automated system to register my weight. The digital display flickered through several readings: 79,840 pounds, then 95,230, then 156,000, then numbers that climbed into impossible territory. My truck couldn't physically weigh 400,000 pounds. But that's what the screen showed before finally settling on a reading that made my stomach drop. 6 pounds. The intercom crackled to life with a voice that sounded official but wrong somehow. "Driver, please proceed to Inspection Bay 3 for document review. Do not attempt to leave the facility until cleared by station personnel." The tone was professional, but there was something underneath it, a quality that reminded me of old recordings played through damaged speakers. I drove to the indicated bay, noting that the facility looked newer than it should have after months of closure. The paint was fresh, the equipment appeared recently installed, and everything had an artificial quality, like a movie set designed to look like a way station rather than an actual government facility. The inspection building was empty, except for a single clerk behind bulletproof glass. He looked normal enough, middle-aged, wearing a standard DUT uniform, reviewing paperwork with the bored efficiency of a career bureaucrat. But when he looked up at me, his eyes reflected light like an animal's, and his smile revealed teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "Documentation, please," he said, sliding a metal tray under the glass partition. I handed over my license, registration, logbook, and bills of lading, the standard paperwork for any commercial vehicle inspection. He reviewed each document with unusual intensity, making notes in a ledger that looked ancient despite the modern facility around us. "Mr. Damari," he said without looking up, "you're carrying quite a load today, much heavier than your paperwork indicates." I started to protest that my calculations were accurate, but he held up a hand to silence me. "I'm not talking about your cargo weight. I'm talking about the other things you're carrying. The guilt, the regret, the corners you've cut to keep your business profitable." The comment caught me off guard. Every independent operator bent rules occasionally, running slightly over hours, skipping maintenance that could wait, taking loads that pushed legal limits. It was survival in an industry with razor-thin profit margins. But this clerk seemed to know specifics about decisions I'd never discussed with anyone. "Your logbook shows some interesting discrepancies," he continued, flipping through pages with supernatural speed. 14-hour driving days logged as 11 hours, required inspections postponed beyond legal limits, cargo weights that mysteriously decreased between pickup and delivery. Each accusation was accurate, and each violation represented a choice I'd made to keep my truck rolling and my bills paid. "I need to see your real records," he said, sliding a different logbook across the counter. One I'd never seen before, but that was filled with my handwriting. It contained every actual mile I'd driven, every actual hour I'd worked, every safety shortcut I'd taken over the past 8 years. Somehow, this impossible place had compiled a complete record of my professional sins. The weight on the scale wasn't measuring my truck and cargo. It was measuring the accumulated weight of every rule I'd broken, every risk I'd taken, every time I'd put profit ahead of safety. And according to their calculation, I was carrying far more than the legal limit. The penalty for operating overweight is immediate impoundment, the clerk explained with that unsettling smile. However, we offer an alternative compliance program for drivers who wish to avoid enforcement action. He slid a contract across the counter, written in language that looked legal but felt deeply wrong. The document offered to clear my violations in exchange for continued service to the facility. The terms were vague but ominous, requiring me to stop at this station for inspection on every future run, regardless of route or cargo. More disturbing were the clauses about recruitment assistance and driver referral incentives that suggested I would be expected to guide other truckers to this place. Many drivers have found our program quite beneficial, the clerk said, gesturing toward a wall of photographs. Dozens of professional driver portraits lined the office, each showing a trucker standing beside their rig with an expression of resigned acceptance. I recognized several faces, drivers who had supposedly retired or left the industry, but who were apparently still connected to this facility in some capacity. "What happens if I refuse?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be unpleasant. The clerk's smile widened, revealing more of those predatory teeth. "The exit gate remains closed until all violations are resolved. And according to our calculations, you're currently carrying violations that would result in permanent license suspension and criminal prosecution. Of course, explaining your situation to outside authorities might prove challenging." I looked around the facility and realized the horrible truth. This wasn't a government inspection station. It was a trap designed to catch drivers who had compromised their integrity for profit. The automated systems had detected not just my physical cargo, but the moral weight I'd been carrying. And now I was being held accountable by something that existed outside the normal regulatory framework. The contract in front of me offered a way out, but at a price that would make me complicit in whatever this place really was. I would become a recruiter, using my reputation and relationships to guide other drivers into the same trap, perpetuating a cycle that fed on the industry's culture of cutting corners and bending rules. I thought about all the drivers who had trusted my recommendations over the years, who had followed routes I'd suggested or taken advice I'd offered. If I signed this contract, I would be betraying every relationship I'd built in the trucking community, turning my experience and credibility into weapons against my fellow drivers. "I need time to think about this," I said. But the clerk shook his head. "The decision must be made now. The facility closes at sunset, and drivers who haven't resolved their violations by then become permanent residents of our extended compliance program." Through the window, I could see the sun approaching the horizon. In the parking lot, some of the trucks from the photographs were still there. Decades-old rigs that should have been in museums, with drivers who should have been long retired still sitting behind the wheel, waiting for instructions that would never come. I grabbed the contract and tore it in half. The clerk's expression didn't change, but something fundamental shifted in the building around us. The modern facade began peeling away like old paint, revealing a much older, more sinister structure underneath. The fluorescent lights flickered and died, replaced by the sickly glow of emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red. "Very well," the clerk said, his voice now echoing with inhuman harmonics. "Bay 7 is available for permanent parking. Your truck will be maintained in operational condition indefinitely, and you'll be available for consultation whenever new drivers require guidance." But as I backed toward the door, my hand found the emergency exit handle. Some part of me remembered that every legitimate government facility was required to have multiple exits. And this one, despite its supernatural properties, was still bound by certain bureaucratic rules. The exit opened onto the real highway, where the actual Barstow way station sat abandoned and covered in genuine construction barriers. My truck was parked on a scale that hadn't been operational in months, and the weight display showed a realistic 79,940 pounds. I drove away without looking back. But I know that place is still out there, waiting for the next driver who has been carrying more weight than their paperwork shows. Some scales measure more than cargo, and some inspections reveal truths that no legitimate authority should ever possess. Every time I pass a weigh station now, I make sure my logs are accurate and my conscience is clear. Because somewhere in the desert, there's a facility that specializes in weighing the things we'd rather not acknowledge. And the penalties for overloading your soul are far worse than any fine the Department of Transportation could ever impose. The trucking community prides itself on drivers helping each other through breakdowns, bad weather, and emergencies. But that trust becomes a weapon when someone starts hunting us with our own protocols. When distress calls become traps and helping a fellow driver turns into running for your life through Louisiana backroads. You learn that predators come in all forms, including ones who know exactly how we think. My name is Jairo, and I've been driving these southern routes for 12 years. I built my reputation on being the guy who'd stop for anyone in trouble. Blown tires, mechanical failures, medical emergencies, whatever. The trucking brotherhood is real, and it saved my life more than once when I've been stranded in the middle of nowhere. We look out for each other because we know that tomorrow we might be the ones needing help. That philosophy almost got me killed on a humid August night in the Louisiana Bayou country. I was running a load of manufactured goods from Baton Rouge to Jacksonville, taking Highway 190 through some of the most isolated stretches of southern Louisiana. It's not the fastest route, but it avoids the traffic congestion around New Orleans and the truck restrictions on several major interstates. The road winds through miles of swampland, past small communities that feel like they exist in a different century. Around 11 p.m., just past the town of Krotz Springs, my CB crackled with a distress call. Mayday, Mayday. This is driver Jenny in a white Volvo. I've got a medical emergency at mile marker 47 on Highway 190. My co-driver's having chest pains. He's unconscious. I need immediate assistance. The voice was female, young, panicked in exactly the way you'd expect from someone dealing with a life-threatening situation. I grabbed my mic immediately. Jenny, this is Jairo, about 15 minutes behind you. I'm en route to your location. Have you called 911? Her response came back shaky but relieved. Thank God, yes. Ambulance is coming, but they said 30 minutes minimum. He's barely breathing. I don't know what to do. Every instinct I had was screaming to help. A driver's co-driver is usually family, spouse, sibling, or close friend. The thought of someone watching their loved one die while waiting for help in the middle of the swamp was unbearable. I pushed my rig up to 75 mph, probably faster than was safe on those winding roads. But medical emergencies don't wait for caution. I spotted the white Volvo exactly where she'd said it would be, parked on the shoulder with hazard lights flashing. A figure was waving frantically from beside the truck, clearly distressed. I pulled over immediately, grabbing my first aid kit and the emergency medical supplies I always carried. But as I approached the truck, something felt wrong. The distressed driver stopped waving and stepped back into the shadows. The truck's sleeper curtains were drawn tight, so I couldn't see inside to check on the alleged patient. Most troubling, there were no signs of genuine medical emergency, no equipment scattered around, no evidence of CPR attempts, none of the chaos you'd expect from someone fighting to save a life. "Where's your co-driver?" I called out, keeping my distance. The figure in the shadows didn't respond immediately, then said in a voice that was definitely not the woman from the radio. "He's inside, but he's not breathing anymore. You're too late to help him, but maybe you can help me instead." That's when I realized I'd been lured into a trap by someone using our own emergency protocols against us. The distress call had been fake, designed to exploit the trucker instinct to help fellow drivers in trouble. I started backing toward my own truck, but the figure stepped into my headlight beam, and I saw something that made my blood freeze. He was holding a CB radio in one hand and a large knife in the other. His truck wasn't white. It was dark blue, and there was no co-driver, unconscious or otherwise. But there were signs that other drivers had been here recently. Personal items scattered around the truck that clearly belonged to different people, and dark stains on the pavement that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "You drivers are so predictable," he said, his voice now calm and conversational. "Always ready to help, always trusting, always stopping when someone calls for assistance. Makes you perfect victims for someone who knows how to push the right buttons." He gestured toward the items around his truck. 6 drivers in the past 2 months. All of them stopped to help poor Jenny with her medical emergency. I realized I was looking at a serial killer who'd been specifically targeting long-haul truckers, using our community's culture of mutual aid to isolate and murder drivers on remote stretches of highway. He'd studied our communication patterns, our emergency procedures, our psychological triggers, and turned them into a hunting methodology. My truck was 50 feet away, but he was positioned between me and the cab. Running into the swamp wasn't an option. The bayou country is full of gators, snakes, and terrain that would trap me worse than staying on the road. I needed to think like a trucker, not a victim. "How do you know so much about truck drivers?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I looked for options. His smile was cold and predatory. "I used to be one of you. 20 years on the road before I discovered I enjoyed the killing more than the driving. Amazing how much you can learn about someone from their CB chatter, their routes, their schedules, their weaknesses." That explained how he'd been so effective. He wasn't an outsider trying to understand trucker culture. He was using insider knowledge to exploit the very trust that held our community together. He knew exactly what kind of distress call would trigger an immediate response, exactly how to sound authentic on the radio, exactly which stretches of road provided the isolation he needed. The beautiful thing is that when drivers disappear on remote routes, everyone assumes it's an accident or mechanical failure. He continued, "Truckers go missing all the time. Medical emergencies, crashes in remote areas, trucks that slide off the road into water. Nobody looks for a pattern when the victims are scattered across multiple states." But while he was explaining his methodology, I was remembering something important about this particular stretch of Highway 190. It passed near a Louisiana State Police training facility, and troopers often used these roads for high-speed pursuit practice. If I could create enough noise and commotion, there was a chance someone would investigate. I keyed my CB radio, which was clipped to my belt, and started broadcasting on the emergency channel. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Jairo at mile marker 47 on Highway 190. I'm being attacked by a driver impersonating distress calls. He's armed and has killed multiple truckers. I need immediate police assistance." The killer lunged toward me, but I was already moving, using my size advantage to tackle him away from his weapon. We crashed into the side of his truck, and I managed to get my hands on his CB radio. I started transmitting continuously. "Louisiana State Police, this is an emergency. Highway 190 mile marker 47. Armed killer targeting truck drivers, multiple victims. Need immediate response." The fight was brutal but brief. He was armed, but I was bigger and desperate. More importantly, I could hear sirens in the distance. Someone had heard my transmissions and was responding. The killer heard them too, and his confidence evaporated as he realized his isolated hunting ground was about to be flooded with law enforcement. He broke away from our struggle and ran toward the swamp, probably figuring he could disappear into the bayou and avoid capture. I didn't try to follow him. I'd seen enough alligator warning signs to know that the swamp was more dangerous than any human predator. The Louisiana State Police arrived within minutes, followed by federal agents who'd been tracking the disappearances I'd unknowingly helped solve. They found enough evidence in and around the killer's truck to connect him to at least 8 murders across 4 states, all involving drivers who'd responded to fake distress calls on isolated highways. They caught him 3 days later, half dead from exposure and alligator bites, trying to steal a boat from a fishing camp 20 miles downstream. He'd been using the fake emergency scenario for over 2 years, specifically targeting drivers who traveled alone on remote routes. The investigation revealed that he'd been monitoring CB traffic to identify potential victims, learning their patterns and vulnerabilities before setting his traps. The experience changed how I respond to emergency calls. I still stop to help drivers in genuine distress, but I'm more cautious about situations that seem perfectly designed to trigger my protective instincts. I carry additional communication equipment now, and I always verify emergency situations with multiple sources before putting myself at risk. The trucking community has had to evolve our safety protocols because of predators like this. We've developed code words and verification procedures to help distinguish genuine emergencies from potential traps. It's sad that our culture of mutual aid has been weaponized, but we're not going to let fear destroy the brotherhood that makes this life bearable. Some of the most dangerous predators are the ones who understand their prey well enough to exploit their virtues. Trust and helpfulness are survival traits in the trucking world, but they can also be vulnerabilities when someone knows exactly how to manipulate them. I still believe in helping fellow drivers, but I've learned that even good intentions need to be tempered with street smarts. The road is dangerous enough without having to worry about wolves in sheep's clothing, but awareness and preparation can keep us safe while preserving the community spirit that makes us more than just individual drivers sharing the same highways. Sometimes the most important cargo we carry is common sense, and it's worth more than any freight we'll ever haul. When your 18-wheeler breaks down in a North Dakota blizzard with temperatures hitting 20 below zero, every light you see in the distance looks like salvation, until you realize they're leading you away from warmth and deeper into the storm. The voices calling out through the howling wind sound so much like rescue workers that you don't notice they're guiding you towards something that feeds on frozen desperation. My name is Elsa, and I've been driving truck for 16 years, with the last 8 spent specializing in cold weather freight runs through the northern tier states. I know how to handle winter driving conditions that send other drivers running south for the season. My Peterbilt is equipped with every cold weather modification available: engine block heaters, auxiliary power units, extra insulation, emergency supplies rated for Arctic conditions. I've weathered ice storms in Minnesota, whiteout conditions in Montana, and temperature drops that would crack lesser trucks like eggs. That confidence nearly killed me on a February night in North Dakota when Mother Nature decided to remind me that all the preparation in the world means nothing when the weather turns truly hostile. I was hauling farm equipment from Fargo to Williston, a routine run I'd made dozens of times. The weather forecast had called for light snow, maybe 3 to 4 inches, with temperatures dropping to around 0 overnight. Standard winter conditions for that region. Nothing I couldn't handle with proper attention and reduced speed. But weather forecasts in the northern plains can change faster than highway conditions, and by the time I reached the halfway point near Newtown, the light snow had become a full-scale blizzard. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet, winds were gusting over 60 miles per hour, and the temperature was plummeting toward 20 below zero. The highway department had started closing sections of interstate behind me. But I was too far from any major town to turn back safely. I'd been crawling along at maybe 25 miles per hour for about an hour when I felt the telltale vibration that every driver dreads. Engine trouble. The temperature gauge was climbing despite the frigid air, and I could hear irregular firing in the cylinders that suggested fuel system problems. In normal conditions, it would have been a manageable breakdown. But in a blizzard with life-threatening cold, mechanical failure becomes a survival emergency. I managed to nurse the truck another 2 miles before the engine seized completely. The cab went silent except for the howling wind and the rattling of ice against the windows. My auxiliary power unit was functioning, providing heat and electrical power. But I knew it only had enough fuel for maybe 8 hours of operation. After that, I'd be completely dependent on whatever warmth I could generate or conserve. Cell phone coverage in rural North Dakota is spotty under the best conditions, and the blizzard was interfering with what little signal existed. I managed to get through to 911 long enough to report my location and situation. But the dispatcher told me what I already knew. No rescue vehicles could operate in current conditions. I was on my own until the storm passed, which weather reports suggested wouldn't be for at least 12 hours. That's when I first saw the lights. They appeared through the blizzard about a quarter-mile ahead, moving in a pattern that suggested people with flashlights conducting some kind of search operation. The lights were bright and steady, cutting through the snow in a way that indicated professional equipment rather than simple emergency flashlights. My first thought was that a rescue team had somehow reached the area despite the impossible conditions. I tried honking my horn to signal my location, but the wind was too loud for the sound to carry effectively. Instead, I bundled up in my emergency gear and prepared to make the dangerous trek through the storm to reach what I assumed were my rescuers. The temperature outside was lethal, the kind of cold that can cause frostbite in minutes and kill through exposure in less than an hour. But as I prepared to leave the relative safety of my cab, I heard voices calling through the storm. They were faint but unmistakably human, shouting directions and coordinates like professional search and rescue personnel. "This way," one voice called. "We found the truck," shouted another. The voices seemed to be moving, getting closer to my position, which suggested the rescue team was actively searching for me. I responded by turning on my emergency flashers and honking the horn in the standard distress pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. The voices immediately responded, calling out acknowledgments and what sounded like updates to a command center. "We have contact with the stranded driver. Moving to intercept. Prepare for emergency extraction." The professional terminology and coordinated response convinced me that a genuine rescue operation was underway. I gathered my emergency supplies and prepared to signal my location more clearly. But as I opened the cab door, the blast of frigid air that hit me carried something that didn't make sense. The voices were coming from different directions simultaneously, as if the rescue team was surrounding my truck but calling out identical messages. That's when I realized the voices weren't quite right. They had the words and tone of professional rescuers, but there was something artificial about them, like recordings played through speakers rather than actual human communication. The coordination was too perfect, the responses too synchronized, and most importantly, no real rescue team would be operating in conditions that made helicopter flight impossible and ground vehicles suicidal. I closed the cab door and tried to think rationally about what was happening. The lights were still visible through the storm, but now they seemed to be moving in patterns that didn't match normal search procedures. Instead of the systematic grid search you'd expect from professionals, The lights were dancing and weaving in ways that looked more like they were trying to attract attention than locate a specific target. The voices continued calling, but now I was listening more critically to what they were actually saying. The phrases were repetitive and generic. Help is coming. Stay where you are. Follow the lights to safety. Without any of the specific information or questions you'd expect from actual rescuers. No one was asking about my condition, my supplies, or the nature of my emergency. They were just trying to get me to leave my truck. I decided to test my theory by broadcasting on my CB radio. This is Elsa, stranded driver at mile marker 132. I can see your rescue lights, but I need you to identify yourselves and your agency. The response came immediately through the external speakers I now realized were hidden around my truck. This is the rescue team, Elsa. We're here to help you. Follow our lights to the extraction point. But the voice that responded wasn't coming through my CB radio. It was coming from outside the truck, broadcasted through the storm by whatever was generating those impossible lights. Real rescuers would have responded on radio frequency, not through hidden speakers that shouldn't exist in the middle of nowhere. The lights were getting closer now, and I could see they weren't attached to people at all. They were floating freely through the blizzard, maintaining perfect formation despite wind gusts that should have scattered any normal objects. As they approached, the voices became more insistent. Elsa, you need to come with us now. Your truck isn't safe. The storm is getting worse. But I knew my truck was the safest place I could be. It was insulated, heated, and stocked with emergency supplies. Leaving it to follow mysterious lights through a deadly blizzard would be suicide, regardless of who or what was calling to me. The only entities that would want me to abandon my shelter in these conditions were ones that didn't have my survival as their priority. The lights began circling my truck, and the voices multiplied until it sounded like dozens of rescuers were calling to me simultaneously. But now I could hear what they were really saying underneath the superficial rescue messages. So cold out here, Elsa. Join us in the snow. It doesn't hurt after the first few minutes. We've been waiting so long for company. I looked more carefully at the area around my truck and realized the horrifying truth. The lights weren't just floating randomly. They were marking locations where other vehicles had stopped over the years. Through the blizzard, I could make out the dark shapes of trucks, cars, and other vehicles scattered across the landscape. All of them abandoned and partially buried by years of accumulated snow. And standing beside each vehicle, barely visible through the storm, were human figures. Drivers who had been stranded in previous blizzards, who had followed the lights away from their vehicles and into the killing cold, who now stood as frozen sentinels in an expanding graveyard of winter victims. The voices weren't rescue workers. They were the voices of previous victims, calling out to lure new travelers into joining their eternal vigil in the North Dakota wasteland. The lights weren't rescue equipment. They were some kind of supernatural phenomenon that fed on the desperation of stranded travelers, using their hope for salvation to draw them to their deaths. I hunkered down in my cab and waited for dawn, ignoring the increasingly desperate calls from outside. The lights danced around my truck all night, and the voices promised warmth, safety, and rescue if I would just step outside and follow them. But I knew that the only warmth they offered was the final warmth that comes just before hypothermia kills you. And the only rescue they provided was rescue from the burden of continued existence. The storm passed at sunrise, and the highway patrol reached me by mid-morning. When I told them about the lights and voices, they exchanged looks that suggested I wasn't the first stranded driver to report similar experiences. The area had a reputation for high numbers of missing travelers during winter storms. People whose vehicles were found empty with no trace of where the occupants had gone. But I knew where they had gone. They were still out there in the prairie, standing beside their abandoned vehicles, waiting for the next blizzard to provide them with new companions in their frozen purgatory. The road teaches you that not every light in the darkness leads to safety. And not every voice calling for help actually wants to help you. Sometimes, the most dangerous thing you can do is leave the shelter you've already found, no matter how cold or uncomfortable it might be. Winter survival isn't just about staying warm. It's about recognizing that some forms of cold go deeper than temperature, and some storms never really end for the people who get caught in them. Sometimes, the loneliest stretches of highway become gathering places for souls who never found their way home. And when you offer a ride to someone who's been walking the same road for decades, you discover that some passengers have destinations that exist outside the boundaries of time. The most terrifying moment isn't when you realize your hitchhiker is dead. It's when you understand he's been guiding you toward joining him in whatever realm he now inhabits. My name is Khalid, and I've been driving the long haul for 28 years, ever since I got out of the Army in 1996. I'm what they call an old-school trucker, the kind who still believes in helping stranded motorists, respects the unwritten rules of the road, and maintains the traditions that made this profession something more than just a job. In a few months, I'll be retiring with a decent pension and a paid-off house in Tucson, ready to spend my golden years away from the endless miles of asphalt that have defined most of my adult life. Route 66 has always been special to me, even though most of the original highway has been bypassed by modern interstates. There are still sections of the old road that run parallel to I-40, stretches of two-lane blacktop that carry echoes of America's automotive glory days. I make it a point to use these vintage routes whenever my schedule allows, partly for nostalgia and partly because they offer a different perspective on the country I've spent 3 decades crossing and recrossing. That October night in Arizona, I was deadheading back to Phoenix after delivering a load in Flagstaff, running empty and in no particular hurry. The weather was perfect for desert driving. Clear skies, full moon, temperature in the comfortable 70s. I'd taken the old Route 66 alignment through Winona and Winslow, enjoying the peace and solitude that comes with roads that time has largely forgotten. It was about 50 miles east of Flagstaff when I saw him walking along the shoulder, a figure in what looked like vintage clothing, moving with the steady pace of someone who'd been walking for a long time. Hitchhiking isn't as common as it used to be, and most truckers are reluctant to pick up strangers for liability and safety reasons. But something about this particular walker triggered my instinct to help. As I got closer, I could see he was an older man, probably in his 60s, wearing a style of clothes that looked like it belonged in the 1950s or early 1960s. Dark slacks, white shirt, thin tie, and a jacket that had seen better days. He wasn't actively trying to flag down rides, just walking steadily westward with the kind of purposeful gait that suggested he had a specific destination in mind. I pulled over and rolled down my passenger window. "Need a lift, partner?" The man approached my cab with a grateful smile, and I got my first good look at his face. He had the weathered features of someone who'd spent a lot of time outdoors, with kind eyes and an expression that seemed somehow familiar, though I was certain I'd never met him before. "Much obliged, driver," he said, climbing into the passenger seat with surprising agility. "Name's Frank Delano, and I'm trying to get home to Holbrook. Been walking this road for what feels like forever." His voice had a slight accent that I couldn't quite place, and his manner of speaking seemed formal in the way that older generations often did. "Khalid Johnson," I replied, putting the truck back in gear. "Holbrook's about 30 miles down the road. What happened to your car?" Frank settled into the seat and looked out at the moonlit desert landscape with an expression that seemed both sad and nostalgic. "Car broke down back in Winona," he said. "Been trying to get home ever since. My wife Betty's probably worried sick. Told her I'd be back by supper time, and that was—" He paused, seeming to calculate something in his head. Well, that was quite a while ago now. As we drove through the night, Frank proved to be excellent company. He told stories about the golden age of Route 66, when the highway was the main artery connecting the Midwest to California, carrying families west in search of new opportunities and adventures. His knowledge of the road's history was encyclopedic. He could point out the locations of long-demolished gas stations, describe the ownership changes of roadside attractions that had closed decades ago, and recite the names of truckers and travelers who had been regular fixtures on the route in its heyday. "Used to be, you could make good time on this road," Frank said as we passed through a small town that looked half abandoned. "Back in '62, I could drive from Chicago to Los Angeles in 3 days, stopping at all the best diners and motor courts along the way. Route 66 was more than just a road. It was a way of life." Something about the way he spoke suggested personal experience rather than just historical knowledge. When I asked him about his own travels on the old highway, his stories became more specific and detailed. He described restaurants that served the best pie in Oklahoma, motor courts with the cleanest rooms and friendliest owners, and truck stops where drivers could get honest mechanical work at fair prices. But as the night wore on, I began to notice inconsistencies in his stories. He mentioned businesses and people as if they were still operating, talked about gas prices and road conditions that hadn't existed for decades, and referenced events and cultural details that seemed frozen in the early 1960s. "Frank," I said carefully, "what year do you think it is?" He looked at me with confusion, as if the question itself didn't make sense. "It's 1962, of course. October 15th, 1962. I remember because it's Betty's birthday, and I promised I'd be home in time for her party. She's probably got the whole neighborhood over by now, wondering where her husband got to." A chill ran down my spine as I realized what I was dealing with. I pulled out my phone and showed him the date display. October 15th, 2024. Frank stared at the screen for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a profound sadness. "That can't be right," he whispered. I was driving home from Flagstaff, where I'd been looking at a job opportunity. The car started overheating near Winona, so I pulled over to let it cool down. Then I started walking, figuring I could get help in the next town. But the next town never seemed to come, and when cars did pass, they looked different, wrong somehow. The horrible truth was becoming clear. Frank had been walking Route 66 for over 60 years, somehow trapped on the road he'd loved in life, unable to reach the home and family that no longer existed. He was a ghost. But not the kind that haunts houses or graveyards. He was a spirit bound to the highway itself, eternally traveling a route that had been bypassed by progress and time. "Betty must be so worried," he continued, his voice breaking. "The party was supposed to start at 7, and I promised I wouldn't be late. She made my favorite cake, German chocolate with that coconut frosting I love so much." I didn't have the heart to tell him that Betty had probably passed away decades ago, that the house they'd shared was likely long demolished, and that the world he remembered had been replaced by something he wouldn't recognize. Instead, I focused on getting him to Holbrook, hoping that somehow reaching his destination might bring him the peace he'd been seeking for 6 decades. But as we approached the Holbrook exit, something strange happened to my GPS and odometer. The digital displays started showing impossible readings. Negative mileage, dates that flickered between 2024 and 1962, and route calculations that included roads that had been closed or destroyed years ago. My truck's modern electronics were being affected by Frank's presence, pulled backward toward the time period where he existed. "There it is," Frank said excitedly, pointing toward a cluster of lights that I knew should be the modern town of Holbrook. But through my windshield, I could see something that didn't match my memories of the area. A small desert community with vintage neon signs, classic cars parked along the streets, and architecture that belonged to the Eisenhower era. I was seeing Holbrook as it had existed in 1962, overlaid onto the modern landscape like a double exposure photograph. Frank was somehow pulling me into his temporal reality, and I realized that if I followed him to his destination, I might become trapped in the same timeless loop that had held him for over half a century. "This is where I get out," Frank said as I pulled into what appeared to be both a modern truck stop and a vintage gas station simultaneously. "Thank you for the ride, Khalid. It's been too long since I met a trucker who understood the real spirit of the road." He opened the passenger door and stepped out into the night. But instead of walking toward the buildings, he simply faded away like morning mist. The vintage overlay disappeared from my vision, leaving only the familiar modern Holbrook truck stop with its LED lighting and contemporary architecture. I never saw Frank again, but I learned later that other drivers had reported similar encounters on that stretch of Route 66. A hitchhiker in vintage clothing who told stories about the road's golden age and always asked to be taken home to Holbrook. Some drivers said they'd given him rides multiple times over the years, never realizing they were meeting the same person. The old highways hold more than just memories. They hold the spirits of people who loved them so much that death couldn't separate them from the road. Frank Delano may never make it home to Betty's birthday party, but he's found a different kind of immortality, one measured in miles rather than years. Sometimes the most meaningful destinations aren't places we can reach. They're the journeys that define who we are. Even after we've run out of time to complete them, the road goes on forever. And for some travelers, that's exactly how they prefer it. When you're certified to haul hazardous materials, you trust that the shipping manifests tell you exactly what kind of danger you're carrying. But sometimes, the real threat isn't what's listed on the paperwork. The moment I realized my cargo was changing me from the inside out, transforming my body in ways that defied every safety protocol I'd ever learned, I understood that some chemicals don't just leak from their containers. They leak into reality itself. My name is Emmeline, and I've been a hazmat-certified truck driver for 11 years, specializing in the transport of dangerous chemicals, radioactive materials, and other substances that require special handling and security clearances. It's demanding work that pays well precisely because of the risks involved. But I've always taken pride in my perfect safety record and meticulous attention to protocol. Every load is treated with the respect that comes from understanding that one mistake could result in environmental disaster or mass casualties. The pickup from Chemtech Industries in Toledo, Ohio, seemed routine when I accepted the load. The manifest listed 12 55-gallon drums of industrial solvent, classified as hazardous, but not requiring the highest level of containment protocols. The destination was a disposal facility in Birmingham, Alabama. A straightforward run down I-75 that I'd made dozens of times with similar cargo. The drums were properly labeled, correctly secured, and accompanied by all the necessary documentation for legal transport of hazardous materials. The loading process went smoothly, with Chemtech's warehouse crew following standard procedures for hazmat cargo. Each drum was inspected for leaks or damage, secured with appropriate restraints, and positioned according to weight distribution requirements. The shipping manager handed me the sealed paperwork and reminded me of the standard protocols. No smoking, no extreme temperature exposure, direct route to destination, immediate notification of any incidents or anomalies. What he didn't mention was that the drums had been sitting in their warehouse for over 2 years, longer than the manufacturer's recommended storage period for that particular chemical compound. I discovered this detail later, buried in fine print on documents I didn't examine closely until it was too late to matter. The first indication that something was wrong came about 4 hours into the drive, somewhere south of Cincinnati. I started noticing an unusual smell in my cab. Not the harsh chemical odor you'd expect from a leak, but something organic and unsettling, like flowers rotting in stagnant water. I pulled over immediately to inspect my cargo, checking each drum for signs of damage or breach of containment. Everything appeared normal. The drums were intact, properly secured, and showing no visible signs of leakage. The smell seemed to be strongest near the trailer's rear doors, but I couldn't identify any obvious source. I documented the inspection in my logbook and continued south, figuring the odor might be coming from something unrelated to my cargo. But the smell grew stronger as the day progressed, and it began to be accompanied by other disturbing symptoms. My vision started playing tricks on me. Colors seemed more vivid and intense than normal, with ordinary objects taking on an almost luminescent quality. Road signs appeared to pulse with their own internal light, and the sky took on shades of blue and purple that didn't match any natural atmospheric conditions I'd ever observed. At first, I attributed these perceptual changes to fatigue and eye strain. Long-haul driving can cause all sorts of visual disturbances, especially when you're fighting to stay alert during the afternoon energy crash. But when I stopped for fuel in Lexington, Kentucky, other people started noticing something wrong with my appearance. The gas station attendant looked at me with obvious concern when I walked inside to pay for fuel. "Ma'am, are you feeling all right? Your skin looks different." I checked myself in the restroom mirror and was shocked by what I saw. My complexion had taken on a subtle greenish tint, and there were dark veins visible beneath my skin that definitely hadn't been there that morning. More disturbing were the changes in my hands. My fingernails had grown noticeably longer and taken on a translucent quality that made them look almost crystalline. When I touched surfaces, they left faint marks that resembled chemical burns, even though I felt no pain or discomfort. I called the shipping company's emergency hotline and described my symptoms. But the dispatcher seemed more concerned about protecting the company from liability than addressing my medical situation. "Did you follow all safety protocols? Were you wearing protective equipment? Did you inspect the cargo properly?" The questions focused on assigning blame rather than providing assistance. When I described the physical changes I was experiencing, the dispatcher's tone shifted from defensive to alarmed. "Ma'am, I need you to pull over immediately and wait for our hazmat response team. Do not continue driving, do not leave your vehicle, and do not allow anyone else to approach your truck." But I was already back on the highway, and the changes were accelerating. My vision had shifted to a spectrum that included colors I had no names for, and I could see energy patterns surrounding other vehicles that looked like heat signatures but moved in ways that defied physics. The landscape itself seemed to be breathing, with trees and buildings pulsing in rhythm with some invisible heartbeat. Most disturbing was the realization that I could somehow sense the contents of my cargo without looking at it. I could feel each drum distinctly, could tell that their contents were no longer the simple industrial solvent listed on the manifest. Whatever was in those containers had been changing during transport, possibly catalyzed by vibration, temperature variations, or chemical reactions that the manufacturer hadn't anticipated. The substance wasn't just leaking from its containers, it was leaking through dimensional boundaries, affecting reality in ways that normal hazardous material protocols couldn't address. I was being exposed to something that existed partially outside normal physical laws, and my body was adapting to accommodate its presence. Around Nashville, I started seeing things that couldn't be there. Other trucks on the highway appeared to be carrying impossible cargo. Loads that defied physics, containers that were somehow larger on the inside than the outside, and drivers who looked human from a distance, but revealed disturbing anatomical differences when viewed closely. I realized I was seeing the world as it really existed beneath the surface of normal perception. The chemical exposure had altered my neurological functioning in ways that allowed me to perceive layers of reality that were normally invisible to human senses. But this enhanced perception came with the terrifying knowledge that the world was far stranger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. The hazmat response team caught up with me at a truck stop outside Bowling Green, Kentucky. They approached my vehicle wearing full environmental suits and carrying detection equipment that registered readings so extreme they had to recalibrate their instruments multiple times. "Ma'am, we need you to step out of the vehicle very slowly and follow our decontamination procedures," the team leader announced through a speaker system. But when I opened my cab door, several of their instruments simply stopped functioning, and the team members closest to my truck began showing signs of the same perceptual changes I was experiencing. The investigation that followed revealed that Chemtech Industries had been illegally storing experimental compounds that weren't listed on any regulatory database. The drums in my trailer contained a mixture of synthetic chemicals and what appeared to be extraterrestrial materials that had been recovered from a classified government research facility. The combination had created a substance that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, affecting both physical matter and consciousness in ways that mainstream science couldn't explain. My exposure had been so extensive that complete decontamination was impossible. The changes to my body and perceptual system were permanent, leaving me able to see and interact with aspects of reality that most people never encounter. I can no longer drive commercially. My altered physiology sets off too many detection systems. But I've found work with government agencies that deal with anomalous materials and situations. The official report classified the incident as an industrial accident involving experimental compounds. But I know the truth is more complex. Some substances don't just pose chemical or biological hazards. They pose existential threats to the nature of reality itself. The hazmat certification process teaches drivers to handle dangerous materials, but there's no training for cargo that can rewrite the fundamental laws of physics. I still drive sometimes, on remote highways where my altered appearance won't attract attention, and my enhanced perception can help me navigate dangers that normal drivers can't even see. The road looks different now. I can see the energy patterns that flow along major traffic corridors, the dimensional weak points where reality becomes thin and unstable, and the places where other travelers from other realities occasionally cross into our world. Some loads are more than just hazardous. They're transformative in ways that change not just the driver, but their entire relationship with the universe. The shipping manifest might list the chemical composition, but it can't warn you about cargo that will fundamentally alter who and what you are. I accepted the risks of hazmat transport, but I never imagined that some of those risks involved becoming something more than human. The road taught me that the most dangerous substances aren't the ones that can kill you. They're the ones that can change you into something that might wish it could die. Now I carry cargo that exists between worlds, serving as a bridge between normal reality and the stranger dimensions that leak through when certain chemicals reach critical mass. It's not the career I planned, but it's the only one that makes sense for someone who has seen too much to ever go back to a normal life. The highway system carries more than just commercial freight. It carries the future of human evolution, one dangerous load at a time. The GPS on your final run should guide you toward retirement and rest. But when every road sign starts displaying destinations from your past and your truck keeps arriving at places that shouldn't exist, you realize some journeys don't end with reaching a destination. The most terrifying discovery isn't that you've been dead for hours. It's understanding that your consciousness refuses to accept the end, driving an endless route through memories that feel more real than the accident that claimed your life. My name is Kabir, and after 31 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, I was finally making my last run before retirement. Tomorrow would mark the official end of my trucking career, and this final load, automotive parts from Detroit to Atlanta, was supposed to be a ceremonial conclusion to 3 decades on America's highways. I'd planned every detail of this farewell journey, choosing a route that would take me past some of the places that had defined my life as a professional driver. The morning started perfectly. My wife Priya had packed my favorite lunch. My grandchildren had decorated the truck with "Happy Retirement, Grandpa" banners. And my dispatcher had assigned me the easiest load of my career. Nothing that required special handling, no tight delivery windows, no challenging route requirements. It was supposed to be a victory lap, a chance to savor the miles one last time before trading my commercial license for a rocking chair and a garden. I'd driven this route hundreds of times over the years, but everything felt different, knowing it was my final trip. Every truck stop held memories of conversations with other drivers. Every way station reminded me of inspections that had tested my professionalism. And every mile marker represented a small piece of the career that had provided for my family and given my life structure and purpose. The first unusual thing I noticed was around Toledo, Ohio, when my GPS started suggesting alternate routes that didn't make sense for my destination. Instead of the logical path south through Cincinnati, it kept trying to direct me towards smaller highways that would take me through my hometown in Pennsylvania, past the truck driving school where I'd learned my trade, and by the terminal where I'd gotten my first job in 1993. I ignored the GPS suggestions and stayed on my planned route, but the navigation system became increasingly insistent. The screen would flash with route recalculations every few minutes, always trying to steer me toward locations that had personal significance rather than geographical logic. When I tried to reprogram the destination, the system kept reverting to addresses I hadn't entered. My childhood home, my first apartment, the hospital where each of my children had been born. More disturbing were the road signs themselves. Standard interstate markers were being replaced, at least in my perception, with destinations that reflected my personal history rather than actual geographical locations. Next exit, first trucking job, 2 miles. Maple Street Elementary School, take exit 47. Wedding chapel where you married Priya, 15 miles ahead. I pulled over at a rest area near Dayton to check my logbook and verify my location. According to my paperwork, I was exactly where I should be, making good time toward Atlanta with no significant delays. But when I looked at my truck in the rest area mirror, something was wrong with the reflection. The retirement banners my grandchildren had attached were gone, replaced by decorations that seemed to shift and change as I watched, sometimes showing birthday celebrations from my past, sometimes displaying images of my children at various ages, sometimes reflecting scenes from holidays and family gatherings that had happened years or even decades ago. Other drivers at the rest area seemed unable to see me clearly. When I tried to make conversation, they looked through me or responded to questions I hadn't asked. A veteran driver I'd known for 15 years walked past without any sign of recognition, even though we'd shared countless meals and conversations over the years. Back on the highway, my radio started picking up transmissions that shouldn't have been possible. Instead of current CB chatter, I was hearing conversations from different periods of my trucking career. My own voice from years past, discussing loads, weather conditions, and route planning with drivers who had retired or passed away long ago. The transmissions were crystal clear, more detailed than any recording, and seemed to respond to my current thoughts and emotions. Breaker 19, this is Kabir making his first solo run, looking for advice on handling the scales in Kentucky. Came my own voice from 1994, nervous and uncertain. Without thinking, I responded with the wisdom I'd gained over 3 decades. Take your time, son. Keep your paperwork organized, and remember that the inspectors are just doing their job. The young version of myself on the radio paused, then responded, "Thanks for the guidance, driver. Hope I can be as experienced as you someday." The conversation continued for several minutes, with me providing encouragement and technical advice to my younger self, sharing knowledge that could only come from having lived through the experiences he was about to face. These temporal conversations became more frequent as I continued south. I found myself talking to versions of myself from different periods of my career. The ambitious young driver trying to build a reputation, the family man balancing work demands with home responsibilities, the seasoned professional training newer drivers. Each conversation felt completely natural, as if the boundaries between past, present, and future had dissolved along this particular stretch of highway. Around Cincinnati, I started seeing other versions of myself in passing vehicles. A younger Kabir driving the first truck I'd owned, waving from the cab of a rig I'd sold 15 years ago. A middle-aged version of myself in the company truck I'd driven during my children's school years, talking animatedly on a cell phone with what I knew was probably my wife, coordinating Little League schedules and parent conferences. The most unsettling sighting was a version of myself that looked older than I currently was, driving a truck I didn't recognize toward a destination that appeared on no maps. When our vehicles passed, the older version of myself looked directly at me through the window and mouthed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "The road doesn't end where you think it does." My destination kept changing without my input. The GPS would show Atlanta one moment, then switch to locations from my past. The trucking company where I'd worked for my first decade, the hospital where my father had died, the church where we'd held my mother's funeral. Each time the destination changed, my truck seemed to be making progress toward that new location. Despite the fact that I was maintaining a consistent southbound course on familiar highways, the afternoon brought the most disturbing revelation. I passed a highway sign that read, "Kabir's Accident Site, Next Exit." And I realized that my memories of the morning were becoming unclear. I couldn't recall the specific details of leaving Detroit, couldn't remember the last conversation with my dispatcher, couldn't even remember stopping for fuel despite the fact that my fuel gauge showed readings that seemed to fluctuate independent of actual consumption. I took the exit indicated by the sign, even though no such exit should have existed on this stretch of I-75. The off-ramp led to a scene that looked like a major accident investigation. Emergency vehicles, traffic cones, and what appeared to be the wreckage of a blue Peterbilt identical to mine. The investigating officers were taking photographs and measurements, documenting a crash scene that looked recent despite the fact that I was clearly alive and driving the truck that appeared to be destroyed on the roadside. One of the investigators approached my cab, but when I rolled down the window, he looked through me as if I wasn't there. He spoke to someone I couldn't see. Looks like the driver fell asleep at the wheel around 11:30 a.m. Truck crossed the median and hit the bridge abutment head-on. He probably never knew what happened. That's when I understood the truth about my final run. I had been making my last delivery, but not in the way I'd planned. The retirement celebration, the ceremonial final load, the planned route past meaningful locations. It had all been interrupted by a moment of inattention, a brief lapse in consciousness that had turned my farewell tour into an actual farewell. I was still driving, still following the route I'd planned, but I was doing it as a spirit unwilling to accept that the journey had ended. Every destination that appeared on my GPS was a place my consciousness wanted to visit one more time. Every conversation with past versions of myself was an attempt to process and preserve the experiences that had defined my identity as a professional driver. The truck I was driving existed in the space between life and death, powered by memories instead of diesel fuel, navigating roads that connected moments rather than miles. My final run had become eternal, a continuous loop through the highlights and landmarks of a career that had meant everything to me. I'm still out here somewhere, driving the highways I loved, visiting the places that mattered, talking to the people who shaped my journey. If you're a driver approaching retirement, or if you've spent decades building relationships with the road itself, you might see me in your mirrors someday. An older driver in a blue Peterbilt, still making deliveries to destinations that exist only in memory. The road never really ends for drivers who love it too much to let go. Some of us just find different ways to keep on trucking long after our logbooks show the final entry. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey through the world of long-haul trucking, make sure to subscribe to Verified Fears for more spine-chilling stories that explore the dark side of life on the road. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of horror enthusiasts who aren't afraid to face the nightmares that lurk in the shadows of everyday life.